Today's conversation is with Dr. Erik Wurz from the University of Helsinki and the Finnish Diving Academy. He studies marine sponges and their role in ocean ecosystems. This episode is part of our series on the ocean's natural cleaning crew, organisms that filter water, recycle nutrients, and help maintain healthy seas, much like the Healthy Seas volunteers who do cleanup work. Together, we'll dive into the hidden world of sponges, why they are so important, and how these simple-looking organisms are anything but simple. Erik, thank you so much for joining me today. I can't wait to learn more on this topic because, truthfully, I don't know much about sponges. So let's start from the beginning. And yes, I've known that there are marine sponges, but for someone else who might think of a sponge only as that yellow thing in their kitchen, what exactly is a marine sponge?
That's actually one of big problem we have, because sponges are highly overlooked species in the ocean, but also we have a lot of sponges in freshwater. So that many people don't know. But
that I didn't know.
I've been living in the Netherlands for quite a while, and we have been diving there in the freshwater lakes. And there's a bunch of species there as well. And I showed the divers I was around with, hey, there's a sponge. And they change color and shape with the seasons. So if you just look outside your doorstep, you will probably see a sponge in water. Even the canals in Amsterdam are full of them. So you will find them everywhere.
And they're an animal, right? They're not a plant?
Yeah, they are quite similar to corals in that respect, because they sit on an object or the floor. They don't move to the human eye. And you could just look at it and say, this is boring, must be a plant, and then move on with your life. But that's not it, because they have all the quantities and qualities of an animal. So they have to eat something actively, they breathe, they poop, they can move, they produce offspring in different ways. So they check all the boxes for being an animal. But then also, just like the corals, everything is rather fluid in biology. So just like corals, they can have symbiotic algae, which are microplants, living in them. So they can harness the energy produced by these symbionts. So it's not that easy to distinguish, really, but for sure they are an animal.
Can you describe to me what they look like, their shape, their color, size, texture?
It's really hard to answer that question. Basically, everything that you can think of. No, literally. So that's one of their superpowers, I would say, that they can rearrange their bodies in anything you can really think of. So sponges are potentially the oldest animal on this planet, and they just have a few cell types that they can mold and shift around depending on the needs of the environment and the special needs they have that moment. So they can really shift their shape, some of the species. And you can have sponges that live under a coral in the cave that the coral structure basically forms. And a sponge underneath would form like a sheet of paper on this coral structure. So it's 2 millimeters thick sheet that covers everything. And that is a sponge. And then in Antarctica, where I also did some research.
Almost like an algae?
Yeah, exactly.
How an algae would go across a rock or something?
So you see it's like something organic is there, but you could not say what it is, probably. And then you get really close. And
if I'm picturing it, it's like a slimy texture, perhaps?
Almost, yeah. But if you get very close, you will probably see many holes. And that is the intake and the outlet of the water that the sponges filter constantly. And so from these paper sheet-like sponges, you can also have huge structures like Antarctica, where we have sponges that grow 2 meters in diameter and 2 meters high. And they are basically shaped like a big vase. So they have one big hole on the top. And on the sides, there's millions and millions of tiny holes where the water gets sucked in and the sponge eats everything that's in the water, and the cleaned water comes out of the top. So basically, you can think of them as a huge cylindrical shaped sieve that actively pumps water through its sides, and it comes out at the top like a chimney.
Okay, so those are hollow on the inside?
Yeah.
Okay, so they're just like this big tube in a way.
Basically, yeah. And they can go from these super big tubes, 2 meters high, 2 meters wide, in all shapes in between, to this one paper sheet thick organic structure on any rocks or coral pieces. So they cover a lot of habitats, really.
How many species are there?
I did not look up the number, but it's above thousands, if not 10,000 sponge species. And
Wow.
we are still discovering new species as we speak right now, because working with sponges is super, super hard because the taxonomy on them is quite tough. You really need to look at their skeleton, and every small detail in these glass needles that they are made up from can determine if it's a new species or not. And especially...
These glass needles?
Yeah, sorry. Maybe I should start at the beginning.
Is that their skeleton,
yeah, exactly.
essentially?
Mm-hmm. So they have a few cell types, but those cell types are, or they can be hosted within a mesh of glass needles. And then again, depending on the sponge species, the skeleton can be made up of different crystalline structures. So I don't want to go into too much detail. But basically, it's teeny tiny millimeter or micrometer sized needles. You can almost think of this, we call it glass wool in Germany. Not sure if that's the right
Glass wool.
translation, which you put in your roof, in your house to insulate against heat loss over the roof and the walls.
Oh, okay.
And
I'm picturing a fiberglass.
Yeah, fiberglass.
Okay.
Exactly. So basically, that's what the sponge has in its skeleton, and the space in between is filled with cells that make the organism alive. And any tiny difference in how these, what we call spicules, or the skeleton of the sponges, how they look, it can be a different species. But now it gets complicated, because...
now it gets complicated.
Sponges are also almost always symbiotic with a lot of bacteria. So within this mesh of the spicules, they also can host different strains of bacteria, and they can harness the energy produced by these bacteria. And nowadays we are living in the time of DNA analysis and all this molecular research. So now my colleagues have a really hard time to distinguish, first of all, what is bacterial signals, what is the animal, the sponge signal, and what does determine which sponge species is which sponge species. Do we determine that based on the community of bacteria they house, or on the skeleton, or on the cell structure of the sponge? So again, it's super fluid, and depending which specialist you ask, they probably would have a different answer on what determines a sponge species. So,
how interesting that sponges can survive with this bacteria in there. What's it doing?
Yeah, the sponge provides a habitat for these bacteria. So the bacteria are protected from being eaten, and they can reproduce very well in the sponge. So it's definitely a symbiotic one, and there can be hundreds and thousands of different bacteria living within one sponge individual and species. And bacteria then can also produce antibiotics, which protect the sponge from being overgrown with algae or barnacles attached to it. So it's a super, super close symbiosis.
That's fascinating.
But then if sponges get damaged, hurt, or a piece gets eaten off, or the environmental factors are not too nice for the sponge, then it can also very easily flip around, and the bacteria can infect the sponge, just like humans get sick every now and then by a bacterial infection. So when this balance between digestion of the bacteria and growth gets out of control, and the bacteria overgrow the sponge, then they can also suffer from that, and they are like an apple, they mold from the outside, and sooner or later that might determine their lifespan.
Interesting.
So this, what we call microbiome, the bacteria associated with the sponges, they have a potential that we have not even started to understand, because we know that there is bacteria living within sponges that produce antibiotics, preventing barnacles growing on a certain type of species of sponge. So that antibiotic or that compound is now being applied in anti-fouling paint on vessels. But also there's bacteria that produce chemicals that might help fight diseases like COVID-19. So there were people working on that. And again, we don't know yet what species of sponges we have down there in the deep sea. We don't know all the species yet. We don't know all the microbiome they have. We don't know all the superpowers this microbiome has. So there's really still a lot to discover, and very interesting research topics.
Okay. So you mentioned freshwater, you mentioned deep sea. Are sponges found in every marine environment?
I would be bold to say yes, because there's from the top of my head, not a single habitat that I could come up with that, would be without sponges. So they are in the polar regions, they are in the tropical regions, they are in the shallow waters, they are in the deep sea.
Now, they're often described as filters or cleaners. Can you explain in simple terms how this works? Like what actually is passing through their body?
I already mentioned earlier in how I would describe a sponge. So it's basically this cylindrical sieve that looks like a chimney. And they have tiny cells within their body that have a small flagella, like a rope. And that rope moves, and by that movement they create a current. So with that current they draw in water at the sides of the sieve. They take everything out of the water, and the water enters to the inner part of the sponge, and then by the current they create, it gets pushed out at the top of the chimney. And
goes in and then pushed out. Okay.
Throughout that process, they basically take out everything that is in the water. And if we look at the ocean, we might see clean water, we might see the ocean floor, we might see seagrass on the seafloor, and we would think, oh, that is actually quite clean water. But if you look at that water through a microscope, you would see there's millions of bacteria, there's viruses. If you look even closer in an electron microscope, you would see that there is sugar particles and minerals, what we call dissolved in the seawater. So that's per definition smaller than 45 micrometers. And that's all food that is floating around. Not visible to us, not visible to fish or whales, but the sponge filtering mesh is so fine that it can take all of this out. Bacteria, viruses, and dissolve.
And still be okay.
Yeah, and still be okay. It's eating that. So all this stuff goes in, gets filtered out, and the water that it pushes out, you could define as ultra clean water. So lab grade water that you would have in your lab if you do analysis or anything. So there is 0.01% of bacteria left over. There's almost no viruses anymore. And of course, that has a huge impact on the local ecosystem, but also on the wider scale region.
And so you said they digest it, that whatever they're taking in, they're digesting, and then they release it. They poop it out, essentially. Yep. And that also helps the ecosystem in some way, doesn't it?
So you're absolutely right. So what sponges excrete really kickstarts the food chain. Because as I described, the bacteria and the small viruses and the small organic matter that floats around in the ocean is very inaccessible for larger animals like starfish or fish or any other critters. So the sponges are really like the meadow that we have where the cows are grazing on, or other plant eaters which are then eaten by other things. And this is what sponges really do. They tap into that potential food that floats around. They make that available by excreting cells, excreting particles, which then fall next to the sponge on the seafloor. And those particles are big enough to be eaten by a starfish. And that starfish is eaten by a fish, and that fish is eaten by a bigger fish, and so on. And that starfish could not eat the bacteria or viruses that are floating around, but the sponge makes it available to the food chain, to the food web. So they have a super critical role in the ocean. And the more we look, the more we find that this is actually happening. And the first time it was described was in the Caribbean reefs and called the sponge loop, because the corals would release dissolved organic matter, and that would simply just float away and no one could eat that. So people were wondering, how can there be such a rainforest, underwater rainforest, in basically a desert of seawater? Because there's very little nutrients, it's very warm, and where does the food come from? So the corals are harvesting the sunlight. The corals die, they poop, they shed cells or other fluids, and only the sponges make that energy available to the higher levels of the food chain. So without sponges, no colorful and fish-rich tropical reefs. And the more we look into it in the deep sea, it's actually super, super similar. And there, I would say sponges even are more important because there's no sunlight anymore. So the corals or the sunlight-driven corals cannot kickstart the food chain there. So sponges are really the only ones that can tap into the bacterial food sources floating around there in the deep sea and like that kickstarting food chain in these dark and cold places.
Wow, okay. I had no idea.
Yeah.
I think I'm well versed in ecology and biology, and then
And
today
then
happens, and I am shocked.
the even cooler thing in the deep sea is in parts of the deep sea across the world, they form something we call now animal forests. So the whole seafloor is covered with sponges that can be 50 centimeters high, 50 centimeters wide, and they are so abundant, so that means that there are so many animals that you don't see the seafloor anymore. So there's sponge next to sponge next to sponge, and that goes on for kilometers. And that's what we call an animal forest.
In the deep sea.
In the deep sea. But also now, this concept also now is found more in shallow waters. Basically everything that is dominated by animals and forms a 3D structure very similar to forests where animals can hide, where they can breed, where they can hunt. So it does not just have to be sponges, but can also be other animals.
So let's go back to the water filtering. How much water can a single sponge filter in a day?
The scientist in me would now like to say, I don't want to answer the question because it depends on so many factors. But some people have made some calculations, and this is now very rough or blunt or whatever you want to call it. But just to give you an idea and impression. So a football-sized sponge in good conditions could filter up to 30,000 liters of water per day.
Per day?
So a football-sized sponge. Wow. And now imagine
That's
you have
small.
A football field filled with these footballs. How much water they could filter in a day? I cannot calculate that number, but it has a lot of zeros. Mm-hmm. And the same people then also made that thought process, like how much would it cost for humans to build a machine, a pump, a filter system to remove bacteria, viruses, and dissolved organic matter from 30,000 liters of water per day, just to give you an idea of how important sponges are for humankind. And they had made very rough calculations, but it would probably be like in the ballpark of 70,000 euros or US dollars, whatever you want to call it. And that is excluding personal costs, like cost for personnel. So if you take those values of money from a single sponge into these animal forests that we just described that cover square kilometers and square kilometers in the deep sea of seafloor, you cannot put enough billions or zeros behind those billions on what sponges do for humankind. So,
yeah, and just by being sponges,
yes,
just doing their thing.
Filtering water and eating what's in the seawater.
So I believe we've already answered the next question, but did you want to add anything to this? So how does the sponge filtration help the nearby species, like the corals and the fish and the seagrass all around it?
We already discussed that they really kickstart the food chain by providing larger chunks of biomass that can be eaten. But that's only the bottom of the start of the iceberg, really. Because just like a forest, they provide a three-dimensional structure. So we call that also ecosystem engineers. Because this three-dimensional structure enables other animals really to live there. They might not eat the sponge, but just by the physical presence of the sponge, they can, for example, climb onto the sponge. So they are higher in the water current, so they can tap into the water that moves faster and they can catch more food. So there's animals that really crawl onto the sponge to sit high on the sponge and catch food. Then there is...
Like a ladder.
Like a ladder, exactly. Then there is fish that live inside the sponge to hide from predators like seals or larger fish. So they can hide there. Then there's fish species specialized in laying their eggs into the sponge. And the sponge protects the eggs from being flushed away and being eaten. So fish need sponges to reproduce. And it's really just like these simple things that make the life around sponges really explode. And again, with that, they are kind of linking in with us humans and providing huge ecosystem services to us because we like to eat, particularly the fish that raise their young, or not raise their young, but the young fish grow up in these animal forests made up of sponges. So again, by potentially harming sponges or removing them, we cut down on our fish stocks in the future. So it's all connected in the ocean.
Wow. Okay, so we've definitely established sponges are cool. Important. Yes. Sponges are cool, and sponges are important.
I hope this podcast helps to make sponges cool.
I hope so too. I think they're cool. I am
You are sold. Very
having
good.
a great time learning about them. I had no
It's
idea.
not just dolphins with their big eyes and turtles. It's also sponges.
Absolutely.
Please put
It's
that in.
time to give the uncharismatic
Yes.
animals a chance.
Exactly.
So, as important as they are, how is climate change and rising ocean temperatures, pollution, sedimentation, all affecting them? Should we be worried?
Again, very complex question to answer from my scientific point of view. However, sponges are potentially the oldest animals on this planet, so they have seen it all. They have seen climate change, volcanic eruptions, ocean acidification, and they have lived through it all. So I'm not too worried, but what I'm worried about is, again, the timescale that change is happening right now on the planet and the combination of factors. So we have very fast climate change, ocean acidification, and any other species out there, just like the sponges, has a hard time to keep up with that timescale. But then also what I have seen in my personal research during my PhD is that really the combination of climate change and ocean acidification with interactions on an industrial scale like fisheries or nutrient runoff, that really can push sponges over the edge of coping with a single stressor, for example. So while they would be very happy with warm water, they would be like, no, I've seen this, warm water is fine with me. But then this warm water is combined with high nutrient discharges from a harbor or a river or whatever. And then this combination between a lot of sediment in the water and the higher temperature, then this is something the sponge has not experienced in the past million years it developed. And that can push a certain species over the edge with coping. And again, then they are disturbed in their natural function, and then certain strains of bacteria might grow too much. The sponge cannot control that bacteria anymore, and the bacteria start to feed on the sponge rather than the other way around, and ultimately killing that particular individual. And that I have seen in my research, that if you really have single stressors, either sediment they can deal with ocean acidification or ocean warming, all fine. For that particular species I work with, But if you combine these things, then that's too much for them.
So the scale of the problems and the short time frame doesn't allow them to evolve fast enough to be able to adapt.
Mm-hmm. And this ties into industrial activities that the humans are doing in the oceans, and especially pushing more and more into the deep ocean. So as one example that I was working with is deep sea bottom fisheries, where a big net is dragged across the ocean floor with bottom contact. Trawling, and that trawl will release a sediment plume behind it. And now we are back in this vicious circle, because the sponges / animal forests provide a lot of habitat and structure for fish. So fishermen actually target these areas where there is a lot of sponge cover to go and catch the fish that are living around those sponges. So they go very close to these sponge grounds, creating these sediment plumes, which potentially impact the sponge. The sponge might die, might not provide a habitat for the fish anymore. And in 10 years, we are wondering, hey, where did all the fish go that we used to catch here? And a very sad example, in Norway, fishermen in the past really have actively going into sponge grounds, removing the sponges because they would clog the nets, right? So if you drag something over the floor and your net is full of sponges, of course you don't catch fish anymore. So there is pictures of tons and tons of sponges on the trawl deck removed from the ocean floor just to go back to the same spot to trawl for the fish and not have the nets clogged by sponges. And that is for me an absolute, mind-blowing, because they are directly connected. The fish are there because of the sponge. And the sponges are hundreds, if not 1,000 years old. So by removing those in a single activity, by trawling there, that link is broken for a very long time.
So they don't know what sponges are doing to help them. They need to listen to this podcast.
Exactly. And that was why
learn how important it is.
That's why we had a European funded project. It's called Sponges. So if you want to look that up, that was focused exactly on that.
Called Sponges?
Yeah, I can send you a link on that. But it was
we'll include it.
Tailored to bring sponges onto the schedule of legislation of policymakers, because they are so critical for a healthy ocean, but also ultimately for us humans.
So how do the sponges deal with the sediment or other larger particles in the water?
So the sponge is actually quite smart, and we don't know yet how, because they just have a few cell types, they have no nervous system, but they can still distinguish between, this is nice food, that's what I eat, oh, and this is a sand grain that I spit out again. So they have the capacity to do that, and they are really efficient in that. But of course, if you throw a hand of sand onto a sieve, there will be something getting stuck in there. So the sponges accumulate these sediments. But then again, it's quite common to have sediment being resuspended in the ocean, so they can deal with that. And that's actually, we termed to make it comparable to us humans, and we call that nowadays the sponges sneeze. And what they do is they contract their body, and by that reducing their volume, and that pushes out the particles they have not eaten and being released by this water current that they create. And basically they sneeze sediment or other particles they cannot digest out. And
has there been...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
And that's really funny because in the beginning we talked about if sponges are animals or plants, but to the human eye you would think they don't move, they must be a plant. But we have done an experiment with a time-lapse camera where we filmed a sponge over 1 year, every 5 minutes. And it was a huge sponge. It's 1.20 meters in diameter, 1 meter high, and it's a very rigid structure if you would touch it. And you would think, well, this is basically a ball made of glass fiber, or fiberglass, as you have called it earlier. And you think, no chance this is moving. And then after a year, we retrieved this camera and we put all these images that were recorded into a movie. And we see that this huge glass fiber ball is moving this instrument that you push together and open to make the sound.
Oh, accordion?
Accordion, yeah. And when I saw that, I was like flabbergasted because it was not millimeter scale. It was really 10 centimeter scale. And this huge thing looked like a lung breathing and pushing out particles and contracting, expanding again. And that was really mind-blowing to see.
What is the most important thing you wish people and policymakers understood about them? And what would protecting sponges actually mean in practice?
What I would like them to understand is really that they are closer linked to us than we would think. So, as we discussed some examples already, clean oceans are really important for humans and sponges are directly impacting that. Fish living in these sponges are really important for us. And by those links, it's really hard to grasp why they are important, but it's really important that we put them on the attention span of large-scale policymaking.
If sponges disappeared tomorrow, what would we notice first? And what would we miss only years from now?
So again, this is now like a thought or a mind experiment, but for sure over the longer time frame we would see fish numbers going down, especially where sponges really kickstart the food chain, because that link is missing between a food source that hardly any marine organism can tap into and the higher trophic levels, basically like larger organisms. So that we would for sure feel sooner or later. And if we would lose sponges, we would also really lose a big library of superpower bacteria which we don't know about yet. So that would be a big loss for humankind for potential pharmaceuticals or other active agents that we could use.
Yeah, I mean, if there's no almost immediate reaction that we can notice, it might be hard for us to...
No, for sure. That's how the human brain works, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't have a direct benefit from something, why would I care about it? But if you look a little bit into it, it's really super large scales that these sponges impact and basically link into everything that we already protect nowadays. So we care about clean oceans, we care about sustainable fishing and fish stocks recovering. And the ocean can only stay clean if we have sponges, and fish stocks can only recover if the small fish can grow up in these three-dimensional structures that sponges form in some place on the planet. So it always sounds a bit sketchy, or not sketchy, but it's all connected in nature and especially in the ocean. And if one small piece is gone, then it might have implications on a much larger scale that we only find out later.
Wow, for sure. This has been so fascinating, Erik. Thank you so much.
Yay, sponges!
Yay, sponges, for sure. Do you feel like we covered everything? Is there anything you want to leave us with?
I think the audience of this podcast gets a good idea now why they should care, and why sponges are really important. And I hope also people start looking into, on their next dive, wherever they go, if they also kind of find a sponge and maybe discover what they are doing in their local environment.
What can we do to help protect sponges?
That's a big question. On a really small scale, I think it's really critical to know that sponges exist. That's something that sits on the ocean floor and doesn't move. Maybe don't step on it, remove it, or leave it in place. Because if you don't know what it is, just leave it. I keep telling my friends and family, please don't buy natural sponges or natural sponge products. Because that's exactly that. People usually free dive down, remove live animals from a reef, break it off, bring it to the surface and wash out all the cells, wash out all the bacteria. And then the skeleton that is left over, they sell as a natural sponge that you can wash yourself with or use for other stuff. And that's really animals removed from the sea, from the ecosystem. So please don't buy natural sponges anymore. But then on a larger scale, really they need a healthy ocean. They need stable temperatures. They need stable pH of the seawater. They need not too much sediment, not too many nutrients. And I think that's really tapping into the big boundaries of the planet. Everything that we are working on already. Sadly not fast enough, but what protects the climate will also protect sponges.
Well, thank you. Thank you again. I will now let you go. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Erik.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Healthy Seas podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, follow and share it with others who care about the ocean. Want to dive deeper? Subscribe to our newsletter at healthyseas.org/newsletter for behind-the-scenes stories, upcoming projects, and partner updates from around the world. There are many ways to be part of the mission. Donate, partner, spread the word, or simply stay connected. Explore how at healthyseas.org/take-action. Together, we can turn marine waste into waves of change.